Sir, someone is watching you right now. The voice was quiet, almost lost beneath the soft hum of the air conditioning in the boardroom, but it was enough to stop Daniel Whitmore's pen in mid-signature. 40 floors above downtown Chicago, the glass walls of Whitmore Tower reflected the pale afternoon light, turning the long conference table into a mirror of polished steel and expensive suits. The executives around him shifted in their chairs, confused by the interruption. At the far end of the room stood a young black girl holding a thin folder against her chest, as if it were armor. She looked barely 20. Her badge read Maya Carter, temporary records assistant. For a moment no one spoke. Then a soft laugh broke the silence. Victoria Langford leaned back in her chair, crossing one elegant leg over the other. She wore a tailored cream jacket, and the diamond engagement ring Daniel had given her 2 months earlier caught the light like a tiny star. Someone is watching him? She repeated with amused disbelief. From where exactly? Maya swallowed but didn't step back. From this room, she said. A few of the board members exchanged looks. One man rubbed his forehead, as if deciding whether this was a joke. Daniel Whitmore slowly set his pen down beside the contract worth nearly $2 billion. His company had spent 6 months negotiating the deal, now lying open in front of him. Interruptions at moments like this simply did not happen. Miss Carter, he said calmly, his voice controlled in the way that had made him famous on Wall Street. This meeting is private. Maya nodded quickly. Yes, sir. I know. Victoria gave a soft chuckle and glanced at the others around the table. This is what happens when building security lets interns wander into executive meetings. The room relaxed slightly. A few quiet smiles appeared. Daniel studied the young woman again. Her clothes were simple, dark slacks and a plain blue sweater, but there was something unusual about the way she stood. She wasn't trembling the way most people would in front of a billionaire and 12 senior executives. She looked certain. You said someone is watching me, Daniel said. Explain. Victoria lifted a hand dismissively. Daniel, this is ridiculous. We're about to finalize the biggest partnership of the year, and we're pausing for conspiracy theories. Maya shifted her weight, but didn't look at Victoria. Her eyes stayed on Daniel. Sir, I wasn't trying to interrupt the deal. I just noticed something earlier when I was organizing files in the hallway network cabinet. The head of IT frowned slightly. Network cabinet. Maya nodded. There's a signal spike every 8 minutes coming from this room. It shouldn't be there. Victoria laughed more openly now. A signal spike. That's adorable. A few executives joined her quiet laughter. Maya's fingers tightened on the folder she held, but her voice remained steady. Sir, the signal isn't part of your system. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. The boardroom fell into a softer silence again, curiosity replacing amusement. Outside the glass walls, the late afternoon sun slid behind a neighboring skyscraper, casting long shadows across the polished table. If it's not part of our system, Daniel asked evenly, what is it? Maya hesitated only a moment before answering. A camera. The words seemed to float in the air between them. Victoria's smile sharpened. Security, she said lightly, turning toward the door. I think Miss Carter has had a very imaginative afternoon. But Maya spoke again before anyone moved. Her voice was still soft, but now it carried across the entire room. Sir, someone installed it to record your meetings. Daniel Whitmore didn't pick up his pen again. Daniel Whitmore did not answer immediately. The quiet hum of the ventilation system seemed louder now, as if the entire room had suddenly become aware of every small sound. The executives around the table looked from Maya to Daniel, and then to Victoria, uncertain whether to laugh or remain serious. Maya stood where she was, the thin folder still pressed against her chest, feeling every pair of eyes in the room studying her as if she did not belong there. In truth, she had never expected to be inside the boardroom at all. 2 hours earlier, she had been down the hall outside the records department, sitting on the carpet beside a rolling card of archived contracts, sorting paper files into alphabetical order. It was quiet work, the kind of task given to temporary assistants who were not expected to ask questions. Maya did not mind. She had grown up watching her mother clean office floors long after midnight, pushing a heavy cart from room to room while the rest of the city slept. Compared to that, filing documents under bright lights felt almost peaceful. Still, Maya had always noticed things other people ignored. When she was a child, she used to sit beside her older brother Marcus while he repaired second-hand laptops on the kitchen table of their small apartment on the south side of Chicago. Marcus would explain every wire, every circuit, every blinking indicator light. He had never finished college, but he could rebuild a computer from spare parts and make it run faster than machines that cost thousands of dollars. Maya learned to watch the way signals move through a network the same way other children learn to watch the weather. Earlier that afternoon, when she opened the metal network cabinet outside the conference hallway to locate an archive drive, she saw something that did not belong there. A small device no larger than a deck of playing cards had been attached behind the router with a thin cable that blended almost perfectly with the others. At first she assumed it was part of the building system, but then she noticed the indicator light. It flashed in a slow, steady rhythm, once every 8 minutes. Marcus had once explained that pattern to her while teaching her how remote streaming worked. It meant data was being uploaded somewhere else. Maya had checked the building network list on the screen beside the cabinet. The device was not registered. That was when she began to follow the signal. It led directly to the executive conference room, where Daniel Whitmore was now sitting at the head of the table preparing to sign a deal that could change the future of his company. Back in the boardroom, Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "how exactly would you know something like that?" Maya hesitated for a moment, aware that any answer she gave might sound unbelievable in a room filled with people who wore suits that cost more than her monthly rent. "My brother works with security systems," she said quietly. Victoria Langford smiled again, though the smile had grown thinner. "Of course he does," she said. "Daniel, with respect, this is clearly a misunderstanding." But Daniel Whitmore had stopped looking at Victoria. His attention remained on Maya Carter, the temporary assistant who had just claimed someone was secretly recording the most private meetings in his building. Daniel Whitmore remained still for several seconds, his eyes studying Maya Carter with the same careful intensity he used when evaluating billion-dollar investments. Around the table, the executives had grown noticeably quieter. The earlier amusement had faded, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that something unusual was happening in a room where control was normally absolute. Victoria Langford leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the polished table. Her voice remained calm, but there was a sharper edge beneath it now. "Daniel, this meeting is already running behind schedule. If there is some misunderstanding with the building network, your technology team can review it after we finish the contract." She gestured lightly toward the open folder in front of him. The document waiting for his signature represented months of negotiation with one of the largest data infrastructure firms in the country. Several of the board members nodded quietly in agreement. For them, the situation seemed simple. A temporary assistant had made a strange claim, and the most efficient solution was to ignore it. Daniel Whitmore did not move his hand toward the pen. Instead, he turned slightly toward the head of information technology, seated halfway down the table. "Greg," he said evenly, "how difficult would it be to verify what Miss Carter is describing?" Greg Simmons adjusted his glasses and hesitated before answering. "If there is an unknown device connected to the internal network, we could detect it. It would take a few minutes to check the system logs." Victoria exhaled softly, her patience beginning to show thin cracks. "Daniel, with respect, anyone could connect a small device to a hallway router. It does not mean someone is secretly recording this meeting." Maya stood silently near the door, aware that every word being spoken could determine whether she kept her temporary job or was escorted out of the building before sunset. Her heart was beating fast now, but she forced herself to remain steady. When Daniel glanced back toward her, she spoke again, her voice calm but clear. "Sir, the signal does not come from the hallway router. It comes from inside this room." A few of the executives turned their heads automatically, scanning the ceiling corners where the official security cameras were mounted. Those devices were large, visible, and part of the building system that Daniel Whitmore had personally approved years earlier. Maya shook her head slightly. "Not those cameras," she said. "This one is smaller." Victoria laughed quietly again, though the sound no longer carried the same effortless confidence. "Are we really doing this?" she asked, looking around the table. "Daniel, we are allowing a records assistant to inspect your conference room now." Daniel Whitmore slowly leaned back in his chair. The late afternoon sunlight had faded further, and the room was now lit mostly by the soft overhead panels embedded in the ceiling. The contract remained open in front of him, unsigned. "Miss Carter," he said at last, "if there is a device in this room, where would it be?" Maya hesitated for only a moment. She had replayed the signal path in her mind several times while standing in the hallway earlier. Her brother Marcus had always told her that electronic signals behaved like water moving through pipes. If you followed the pressure changes carefully enough, you could find the source. Maya lifted one hand slowly and pointed toward the far side of the boardroom. "Inside the air filtration unit above the wall cabinet," she said quietly. The entire table turned to look. The silver vent panel sat nearly 8 feet above the floor, blending perfectly with the modern design of the room. It had been there for years. No one had ever paid attention to it. Victoria's smile disappeared completely. For several seconds, no one in the room moved. The executives followed Maya Carter's pointing hand toward the silver air filtration vent mounted high on the wall, nearly 8 feet above the floor. It looked exactly like every other ventilation panel in the building, smooth, rectangular, and completely ordinary. Daniel Whitmore slowly turned his head toward Greg Simmons from the technology department. Greg hesitated, clearly aware that the next few moments might either end an awkward misunderstanding or confirm something far more serious. "Sir," Greg said carefully, "the vent unit could be opened. It would take a ladder and a screwdriver." Victoria Langford let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a soft laugh. "Daniel, this is getting absurd," she said. "You cannot seriously believe there is a hidden surveillance device inside your air filter because a temporary assistant pointed at the ceiling." Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he stood up from his chair, a small movement that caused the entire table to shift with sudden attention. When the founder of a company valued in the tens of billions of dollars stood during a board meeting, people noticed. He walked a few steps toward the wall where the vent panel sat above a sleek storage cabinet. The metal grille reflected the soft ceiling lights, revealing nothing unusual. Daniel studied it quietly for a moment, then turned back toward Greg. "Have someone bring a ladder," he said. Victoria's chair moved sharply against the polished floor. "Daniel," she said more firmly now, "this is a waste of time. We are about to sign a contract that has taken half a year to negotiate. We cannot halt everything because someone decided to play detective." Her voice carried the calm authority that had helped her build a reputation as one of the sharpest corporate attorneys in Chicago. Several executives looked uncertain again, caught between loyalty to the chief executive and the logic of Victoria's argument. Maya Carter remained near the doorway, her back straight, though she felt the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She understood exactly how strange her claim sounded inside a room filled with people who were used to controlling every detail of their environment. But she also knew what she had seen on the network monitor. Signals did not lie. Greg cleared his throat and stepped toward the wall cabinet beneath the vent. "Maintenance keeps a ladder in the hallway storage closet," he said. "I can get it quickly." Daniel nodded once. "Do it." Greg left the room, the door closing softly behind him. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Outside the glass walls, the Chicago skyline had begun to glow with the first lights of early evening. Cars moved like slow lines of red and white far below on the streets. Inside the boardroom, no one spoke. Victoria folded her arms and leaned back in her chair, watching Maya with a cool expression that held none of the earlier amusement. "Miss Carter," she said after a moment, her tone measured but unmistakably sharp. "I hope you understand how serious a claim like this is. If there is nothing inside that vent, you will have interrupted a confidential executive meeting for no reason." Maya met her gaze, but did not raise her voice. "Yes, ma'am," she said quietly. "I understand." The door opened again a minute later as Greg returned carrying a lightweight aluminum ladder. He positioned it beneath the vent panel while several executives leaned forward slightly in their seats. The room had become completely silent now, except for the faint click of metal as Greg unfolded the ladder and climbed the first step. Daniel Whitmore stood beside the cabinet, watching carefully. Maya did not move from the doorway. Greg reached the top step and raised a screwdriver toward the corner screws holding the vent cover in place. One by one he began loosening them. The small metallic turns echoed softly through the boardroom as the final screw fell into his palm and the silver panel slowly pulled away from the wall. Greg Simmons held the silver vent cover carefully with one hand while balancing on the top step of the aluminum ladder. The room was so quiet that the faint movement of the ventilation system could be heard through the open duct. Everyone at the conference table leaned forward slightly, watching the narrow space behind the wall panel as if the darkness inside might suddenly reveal something impossible. For a moment Greg said nothing. He simply reached one hand into the opening and felt along the metal interior of the ventilation housing. Daniel Whitmore stood beside the cabinet with his arms folded, his eyes never leaving the space above Greg's shoulder. Victoria Langford sat perfectly still at the conference table, her posture composed, but the confident smile that had once rested easily on her face was gone. Greg shifted slightly on the ladder and then paused. "There is something here," he said quietly. The words moved through the room like a cold draft. Several executives exchanged quick looks, unsure whether to feel relieved that the strange claim had some explanation or worried about what Greg might pull from the vent. Greg carefully slid his fingers deeper into the narrow space, and then slowly withdrew his hand. Between his fingers was a small black device no larger than a matchbox. A thin wire ran from the back of it, disappearing briefly into the vent before connecting to a tiny battery pack taped along the inner metal wall. Greg stared at it for a moment before speaking again. "This is not part of the building system." Daniel Whitmore stepped closer, his voice calm, but unmistakably focused. "Bring it down." Greg climbed carefully down the ladder, holding the device as if it might break under pressure. When his feet touched the floor, he placed the object on the polished surface of the conference table. Under the bright overhead lights, the device became unmistakably clear. A tiny circular lens sat at the front, no wider than the tip of a pencil eraser. Beside it, a small indicator light blinked faintly every few seconds. Maya Carter watched silently from near the doorway. The rhythm of that light was exactly the pattern she had seen earlier on the network monitor outside in the hallway cabinet. 8 minutes. The signal pulse that had first drawn her attention. Greg leaned closer, examining the wiring. "It is a wireless microcamera," he said. "Battery-powered. The data is transmitted through the internal network." One of the board members let out a slow breath. Another executive leaned back in his chair as if trying to process the realization settling across the room. Daniel Whitmore looked down at the device without speaking. For a man who had built an empire on protecting corporate information, the presence of a hidden camera inside his private boardroom was almost unimaginable. Victoria Langford suddenly pushed her chair back slightly. "That proves nothing," she said quickly, her voice returning with controlled certainty. "Anyone could have placed it there. This building has hundreds of employees and contractors." Greg frowned thoughtfully while turning the small device in his hands. "Actually, that might not be accurate," he said slowly. "This model connects to a specific cloud server. If we check the network logs, we should be able to see where the signal is being sent." The room fell silent again. Daniel Whitmore lifted his gaze from the device and looked toward Greg. "Find the destination," he said quietly. Greg nodded and reached for his tablet computer on the table, beginning to access the network diagnostics. Maya remained where she stood, her hands resting against the folder she still held, while across the table Victoria Langford watched the screen with an expression that had become very still. Greg Simmons placed his tablet flat on the conference table and began typing carefully, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly in his glasses. The executives around the room leaned forward again, their earlier skepticism replaced by a quiet tension that filled the air like a pressure system before a storm. On the polished surface of the table, the small black camera remained motionless beside the open contract that Daniel Whitmore had been preparing to sign. Only minutes earlier, its tiny indicator light continued blinking in a slow rhythm, calmly sending information somewhere beyond the walls of the building. Maya Carter stood near the doorway without speaking. She could feel the shift in the room, even though no one had turned to look at her again. Earlier, she had been an interruption, a temporary assistant who had stepped into a space where she did not belong. Now every person in the room understood that the situation had changed. Greg's fingers moved across the tablet screen as he opened the internal network diagnostic program. A series of connection logs appeared, long lines of numbers and timestamps that recorded every signal traveling through the building's servers. "The device is active," he said quietly after a moment. "It has been transmitting data for several weeks." One of the board members sat back in his chair and let out a low breath. Several weeks, he repeated slowly. Daniel Whitmore remained standing beside the cabinet, his attention fixed on the screen. Can you see where the information is going? Greg nodded slightly while scrolling through the connection records. Yes, sir. The device connects to a cloud server every 8 minutes. The data packets are small but consistent. He paused, studying a line of encrypted addresses. The room remained silent except for the faint tapping of his fingers against the glass surface of the tablet. Outside the tall windows of Whitmore Tower, the sky had darkened into deep evening blue and the lights of the city stretched across the horizon like distant constellations. Inside the boardroom, no one spoke. Finally, Greg stopped scrolling. His eyes narrowed slightly as he examined the destination address attached to the most recent signal transfer. This is interesting, he said slowly. Daniel Whitmore's voice remained calm but direct. Explain. Greg adjusted the tablet so the screen faced the center of the table. The server receiving the footage is not anonymous. It belongs to a registered cloud storage account. Several executives leaned closer, trying to read the information displayed on the screen. Victoria Langford remained seated at the table with her hands resting together, her posture still composed though the brightness had drained from her expression. Greg took a quiet breath before continuing. The account is connected to a private corporate archive used for legal document backups. One of the board members frowned. Whose archive? Greg hesitated for a moment as if making certain he had read the line correctly. Then he spoke again, his voice lower than before. It is registered under the Langford Legal Group. The words settled heavily across the room. For several seconds no one moved. Daniel Whitmore slowly turned his head toward the far end of the conference table where Victoria Langford was sitting. The woman who had been laughing earlier now stared at the tablet screen without blinking. The small camera on the table continued its quiet pulse, the indicator light flashing again as another signal prepared to leave the building. No one in the boardroom spoke. The words Greg Simmons had just said seemed to linger in the air like an echo that refused to fade. Langford Legal Group. The name was not unfamiliar to anyone at the table. In fact, it was the firm that had represented Whitmore Industries for the last 3 years in several complex corporate negotiations. Slowly, almost deliberately, Daniel Whitmore turned his gaze toward the far end of the conference table. Victoria Langford remained seated exactly where she had been moments earlier, her posture upright, her hands resting together on the polished surface of the table. But something in the room had shifted. The confident ease that once surrounded her presence was gone, replaced by a quiet tension that everyone could feel. Greg looked uncertain for a moment, glancing between the tablet screen and the executives seated around him. Sir, he said carefully, the data route is very clear. The transmissions from this device have been automatically uploading to a secured archive connected to that account. One of the board members leaned closer to see the screen, his eyebrows rising slightly as he read the address for himself. Another executive slowly shook his head as if trying to process the implication. Daniel Whitmore spoke at last, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. Victoria. She did not immediately look up. Instead, she drew a slow breath before lifting her eyes toward him. Daniel, this is obviously some kind of technical confusion, she said smoothly. Cloud routing can redirect signals through many servers before reaching the final destination. Her explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, and for a moment the room hovered in uncertainty again. Greg, however, shook his head quietly. No, ma'am. That is not what this log shows. The data is being sent directly to a private storage vault registered under the Langford Legal Group account. The authentication key matches the one used by your firm. Victoria's fingers tightened slightly against the table, though her expression remained composed. Even if that were true, she replied, it still does not prove that I placed that device there. Daniel Whitmore did not respond right away. He stepped closer to the table where the tiny camera still lay beneath the bright conference lights. For several seconds, he simply looked at it, the small lens reflecting the room around it like a silent witness. Then he looked back toward Greg. When did the transmissions begin? Greg tapped the screen again and scrolled through the log history. The earliest record we have is 23 days ago, he said. A murmur moved through the executives. 23 days meant the device had been active during several confidential board discussions, including the early stages of the contract now sitting and signed on the table. Daniel's gaze slowly returned to Victoria. 23 days, he repeated quietly. Victoria finally stood from her chair, smoothing the front of her jacket with careful precision. Daniel, you are drawing conclusions far too quickly, she said. My firm manages dozens of cloud archives. Someone inside the company could have accessed the account without my knowledge. Her voice remained steady, but the room no longer carried the same sense of certainty that had supported her moments earlier. Near the doorway, Maya Carter watched silently, her hands still resting on the folder she held. She had not moved since the moment Greg placed the camera on the table. She had simply followed the conversation as it unfolded, knowing that the truth often revealed itself slowly when people were forced to look directly at the evidence. Daniel Whitmore studied Victoria for several seconds longer. Then he spoke again, his tone quieter than before, but far more final. Greg, he said without looking away from her. Open the authentication record. Greg nodded and touched the screen again. A new line of data appeared beneath the cloud address, listing the access credentials used to authorize the storage vault. The room grew completely silent as the name attached to the account appeared clearly on the display. Victoria Langford. The name on the tablet screen seemed to freeze the air inside the boardroom. Victoria Langford. For a long moment no one spoke. The quiet blinking light on the small camera continued its steady rhythm, as if completely unaware that the secret it carried had just been exposed. Daniel Whitmore did not raise his voice. He simply looked at the tablet, then at Victoria, his expression unreadable. Around the table the executives remained perfectly still, the weight of the moment pressing down on every person in the room. Victoria kept her posture straight, but the calm certainty that once filled her voice had begun to fade. She glanced at the screen again, as if hoping the letters might somehow rearrange themselves into a different explanation. Greg Simmons slowly lowered the tablet onto the table so that everyone could see the authentication record clearly. The access key listed only one primary administrator for the storage account, Victoria Langford. One of the senior board members leaned back in his chair, releasing a slow breath through his nose. That is not a routing error, he said quietly. Daniel Whitmore remained silent for several seconds longer before finally speaking. Victoria, he said calmly. The single word carried more weight than any accusation. Victoria closed her eyes briefly and then opened them again. When she spoke this time her voice was lower, stripped of the smooth confidence that had once made her arguments so persuasive in courtrooms and negotiations. Daniel, you need to understand something, she said slowly. This was never supposed to become personal. The statement moved through the room like a sudden change in temperature. Several executives looked toward her with visible shock. Daniel did not interrupt. Victoria drew in a steady breath as if choosing her words carefully. 3 months ago a competitor approached my firm, she continued. They wanted information about your upcoming acquisitions. At first I refused, but then they offered something very different. She paused again, her eyes moving briefly toward the window where the lights of Chicago shimmered across the evening skyline. They offered enough money to buy half the firms in this city. A quiet murmur rippled around the table. Victoria lifted her hands slightly in a gesture that was almost apologetic. The camera was supposed to capture strategic discussions only. Nothing more. I was going to pass the recordings along through a private archive before any deals were finalized. Daniel Whitmore studied her without visible emotion. Including the contract sitting on this table, he asked. Victoria did not answer immediately, but the silence that followed was answer enough. Greg Simmons stared down at the small device again, as if seeing it for the first time. 23 days of recorded meetings meant dozens of conversations that were never meant to leave the room. Victoria finally looked directly at Daniel. I did not expect anyone to notice the signal, she admitted quietly. Most people never look that closely at network traffic. At the doorway, Maya Carter remained still, listening as the truth unfolded piece by piece. She felt none of the satisfaction some people might expect in a moment like this. Instead, there was only a strange calm realization that the quiet detail she had noticed earlier that afternoon had changed the course of everything happening in the room. Daniel Whitmore reached down and picked up the small camera between 2 fingers, turning it slightly beneath the light. Then he placed it back on the table and spoke again. You underestimated someone, he said quietly. His eyes shifted toward the doorway where Maya Carter stood. The room remained silent after Daniel Whitmore's words settled across the table. You underestimated someone. His gaze rested on Maya Carter for only a moment, but it was enough to shift the attention of everyone in the room toward the doorway where she stood. For the first time since the camera had been discovered, the executives truly looked at her. Not as a temporary assistant holding a folder, not as the daughter of a janitor who had stepped into a meeting she was never meant to attend, but as the person who had noticed what none of them had seen. Maya felt the weight of their attention but did not move. She simply stood quietly, the same way she had stood when she first spoke. Daniel Whitmore turned his attention back to the table. The unsigned contract still lay open under the conference lights, its pages perfectly aligned, the pen beside it untouched. 20 minutes earlier the room had been focused on a partnership worth billions of dollars. Now the entire conversation had shifted because of a signal that blinked every 8 minutes. Victoria Langford slowly lowered herself back into her chair. The sharp confidence that once defined her presence was gone, replaced by a quiet resignation that seemed to settle around her shoulders. For a long moment, she did not speak. Finally, she looked across the table. At Daniel. What happens now? She asked softly. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he picked up the small camera again and held it between his fingers, studying the tiny lens that had watched every meeting from inside the ventilation system. Then he placed it carefully on the table and spoke with calm clarity. Greg, disconnect the device and secure the network logs. I want a full internal review of every transmission it sent. Greg nodded immediately. Yes, sir. Daniel turned to the rest of the executives seated around the table. This meeting is adjourned. Chairs moved slowly as the board members stood, their expressions still carrying the stunned realization of what had nearly happened. One by one they left the room, speaking quietly among themselves. Within minutes the large conference table was nearly empty. Greg gathered the camera and tablet before leaving as well, closing the door gently behind him. Only 3 people remained inside the boardroom now. Daniel Whitmore, Victoria Langford, and Maya Carter near the doorway. Victoria rose from her chair once more. She looked at Daniel for a moment as if searching for something in his expression, but whatever she hoped to find was not there. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit, her footsteps quiet against the polished floor. The door closed softly behind her, leaving the room almost completely still. Daniel Whitmore remained standing beside the table, looking out through the glass wall toward the lights of Chicago spreading across the evening skyline. After a few seconds, he turned toward the doorway. Maya Carter was still there, holding the same folder she had carried all afternoon. Miss Carter, he said. She stepped forward slightly. Yes, sir. Daniel studied her for a moment before speaking again. How long have you been working in this building? 2 weeks, Maya answered honestly. A faint expression crossed his face, something between surprise and quiet approval. He nodded once. Sometimes the most important details are the ones everyone else overlooks. Maya did not know what to say to that, so she simply nodded in return. Daniel glanced once more at the empty chair where Victoria had been sitting earlier, then back at Maya. Human Resources will contact you tomorrow morning, he said calmly. Maya blinked in confusion. Sir. Daniel Whitmore gave a small, thoughtful nod toward the conference table where the tiny camera had once rested. Someone who notices signals like that should not be filing records. Outside the glass walls the city lights continued to glow, and for the first time that evening the boardroom was completely quiet.